This next session, we have 5 speakers. The first one is a keynote speaker. I should introduce myself first. My name's Mick Clout from the University of Auckland. I've been involved in organising the last 2 of these conferences in Auckland, along with Dick Veitch. And so it's a great pleasure to be here in Bonnie Dundee and to be here at the 3rd conference. So our first speaker is James Russell, who I'll introduce shortly, but we have 4 other speakers. It's a mixed bag of papers which cover a wide range of areas of the world, from New Zealand to Mexico to the Arctic and the UK, which is sort of in the Arctic, I think, sometimes anyway. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce James Russell. James Russell is a colleague of mine from the University of Auckland who's worked on invasives on islands around the world. And he's going to be talking today about a strategic environmental assessment for invasive species management on inhabited islands, which is the next big challenge that we have. So I'd like to introduce James to speak, please.
Dr. James. Thank you, Mick. Yes, I feel very privileged having actually managed to make it to all 3 of the Island Invasives conferences. In stark contrast, this year I was surprised to find my name on a piece of paper saying reserved at the front of the theatre. At the first conference I would have been the student volunteer printing those pieces of paper for the reserved people. The second conference was even more exciting because the day before I'd been evacuated from a cyclone by the military in French Polynesia and had to reconstruct my talk the night before. So Tony will be pleased to know that I put a bit more effort than the night before into this talk. I'm going to start by showing you what New Zealand is so proud of, and here is a chart, a figure from a paper Mick Clout and I published in 2006 showing New Zealand rodent eradications from 1964 to 2004. And what's really exciting here is you can see that linear trajectory, but on an exponential scale, a logarithmic scale. So every decade in New Zealand's history over the last 50 years, we've increased by a factor of 10 the size of islands from which we can remove invasive rodents. However, if we convert this and add in the most recent 10 years through to 2014, we see New Zealand's continued to do really amazing numbers of rodent eradications on many islands, but you can see this decline. We haven't actually continued that trajectory of positive growth in the size of islands from which we can remove at least invasive rodents. Why is that? The answer is quite simple. Eradications now target non-Department of Conservation islands with stakeholders and local community whose attitudes affect management. It's no longer just one government entity going to their own island, which is uninhabited and forested. These are now becoming much more complex eradications they have to engage in. So, if we pose the question, what is the major challenge to eradications on inhabited islands? A good friend of mine, Holly Jones, said to me after a plenary many years ago, you've got to do 2 things at a plenary, James. One of them is you can either rally the troops, or the other one is you can stir controversy. And for the last year, I've been very privileged to be able to rally the troops around New Zealand and globally around this idea of a predator-free New Zealand. But on Thursday night, Mick Clout will be giving a public talk to rally the troops here around ideas such as predator-free New Zealand. So instead, I'm going to stir controversy. So bear with me as I suggest that the major challenge to eradications on inhabited islands is biologists. There is a disclaimer there. What I will talk about today comes from the benefit of hindsight and couldn't necessarily be anticipated in advance. So we should not be taking this as reflecting poorly whatsoever on those biologists who have passionately invested themselves in advocating for invasive mammal eradications on islands. But the challenge is that in the first instances, the people that have been going to these inhabited islands around the world and proposing eradications have been biologists, and they've been passionate about biodiversity values, and they've got academic training in biology. What they don't have is training in social science or a broader empathy, if you like, about other values or what's important to people living on the island all their lives, for many generations even. So I think the challenge that we have got at the moment is not the people living on the islands safeguarding the animals we want to protect, the flora and fauna, but it's the biologists going to the islands and trying in the first instance to encourage these eradications. So I want to start with the cautionary tale of Lord Howe Island. So Lord Howe Island, the eradication of black rats and mice was proposed in 2001. A fairly audacious goal back then, given it was 1,800 hectare island, and after 5 years of thinking about it, planning commenced in 2006. It was promoted as the first eradication on an inhabited island, and that seems something you would want. You'd be, yes, you're going to be the first in the world to have this. And this was on an inhabited island of 350 people. There are clear biodiversity, and a paper has just come out this year recently citing the economic benefits, if they weren't already clear, and that's something I'll come back to throughout this talk, is that there are so much more than biodiversity benefits that are to be gained from eradications on islands. In fact, the biodiversity benefits would be probably one of the minor goals you might get from doing a predator or a pest eradication on an island. But subsequently, from that proposal, it was met with resistance by some residents, and a 2015 referendum only narrowly came out in favour of rodent eradication. So something's going on this island if something that's so obvious to us, the eradication of black rats and mice, would have these wonderful biodiversity goals, is being met by resistance and has taken over 15 years and still hasn't actually taken place. So Lord Howe Island was pretty much the first opportunity we had to realise the way we're engaging with people on inhabited islands is not appropriate for the goals we want to see. So I want to start with the definition of inhabitation. I think definitions are critical in all science. If you don't have a clear definition, then we're going to be arguing at odds over what is inhabited and what is not. And the working definition I take is inhabitation of an island incorporates the basic infrastructure to enable a community to function socially and economically, such as any of schools, churches, community buildings or general shared spaces, alongside enterprises, delivering goods and services and opportunities for residents to pursue a range of livelihoods and opportunities in the public and private sectors. It's a mouthful, but it essentially says this is a community of people living amongst themselves. And what this creates is the blackboard or the rich tapestry for which they can create opinions and dissent among themselves and dissent with people from off the island. So an inhabited island isn't one which just has a ranger's station or an island in the Falklands, say, with just one farmer and his family living on it. That's got people living on it, but it's not an inhabited island, certainly not in the sense that we see the controversy that arises where the residents living on an island are at odds over being for and against an eradication. So I think that's important to bear in mind, particularly when we go back to reflecting on what is the first eradication on an inhabited island and what are the challenges for achieving and scaling up eradications on islands which are inhabited. And indeed, if we apply this definition, we see, as Bisbal spoke earlier, that was achieved on the islands of Scilly and Goug off the southwest coast. So we did some work on the Hauraki Gulf Islands, which are just off Auckland Harbour, where the first two conferences have been held. And we have 4 islands here with a variety of critters. You can see Great Barrier Island, the 4th largest offshore island on the coast of New Zealand, 27,000 hectares, and that has black rats and cats as the introduced predators. Here we have Kowau Island with possums, cats, rats, stoats, and the charismatic wallaby. We have Rakino Island here with Norway rats was on it, and here we have Waiheke Island with black rats, cats, and stoats. Now what those 4 islands have in common is inhabitation, and the question we wanted to approach with this group of islands is just like you wouldn't necessarily go to 4 islands in an island group and assume it's all just the same recipe for doing a biological eradication. Perhaps even though we have 4 inhabited islands off the coast of New Zealand, they're not all identical in how you would approach the community and engage with them. Indeed, Great Barrier Island is incredibly remote with poor connectivity to the mainland and only 1,000 people living on it. Waiheke Island is a commuting suburb of Auckland with 7,000 people and ferries going every hour back and forth, and a different suite of species on them as well, for which humans reflect their values off them. So whereas people on Kowau Island some of them want the wallabies eradicated, others value them as part of the cultural historical legacy of introductions to the island. And what was also very useful here for this experimental framework that my master's student worked on was that Rakino Island had actually had Norway rats eradicated through a ground-based eradication a few years earlier. So we sort of had the typical natural experiment you see in invasion biology, where one island had had its rats removed and the other 3 still had rats and other introduced predators. So we could see, how did this change the community's attitudes, and was there anything special about that island that facilitated eradication of those rats in early 2000. So those rats are gone from Rakino Island, so a wonderful opportunity here. And a very long thesis, and I'll just summarize it very briefly here, but what we consistently saw among these 4 islands was there are high levels of self-employment and low incomes. And if you can imagine going anywhere in the world, whether it's a continental city or an inhabited island, where you have high levels of self-employment and low incomes, there is a lack of resilience to disturbance. You're not in a position where you can go on holiday for a few months or have your income challenged or something. And this is particularly important when we look at other things going on these inhabited islands in the Hauraki Gulf. There's higher levels of engagement with the land and the outdoors, particularly through employment. So a lot of their livelihoods are generated from closer relationships with the land. They're not urbanized. Their relationships are with primary industry, through cattle and livestock, or through fisheries. And so if you're proposing something that, say, an aerial Britificum eradication that would remove stock for 6 months, you're immediately hitting how they engage with their land, and you're immediately disturbing what they rely on for their very tenuous incomes. And similarly, although all 4 islands had similarly strong senses of environmental awareness, so we also took a comparative sample from the urbanized Auckland mainland, a city of 1.5 million people, we found that all 4 groups, all 4 islands had people strongly invested in conservation and environment. They really were passionate about that. So we would hope that that's all the more reason they would be motivated to participate in invasive species eradication. But again, history had shown us that was not the case. But there are interestingly different elements for Aquino, where rat eradication had already occurred 15 years earlier, in fact, and the values that they ascribed to the environment on the other 3 islands were just a subset. So on Aquino Island, the community of about only 30 or 40 residents living there, they had seen the importance of species coming back and being translocated, and how that added a new dimension to their environmental awareness and how they interacted with their community. Interestingly, having had that eradication 15 years ago, one of the challenges they now have is that new land owners that come on have never lived with rats on the island, and so they're a lot more laissez-faire to biosecurity as compared to those people that were living there when rats were there. So as we push forward with more and more eradications on inhabited islands, we're going to start to see some of these downstream effects, perhaps of what some of the negative impacts of having native biodiversity in larger numbers are, or landowners that forget what some of the impacts used to be. And finally, a point I want to touch on is there were many unoccupied holiday dwellings on these islands, which must be considered in social engagement. It's not just enough to go to islands and work with the people that are living on them. Some people have holiday homes, and indeed there's even uninhabited islands, as we heard earlier in the Lundi group, where even though there's no one living on them, I think you could still identify stakeholders on the mainland or on the nearby continent who have a vested interest in conservation on those islands. So a very quick summary of what we found. The good news was those 4 islands came out very similar and within themselves, very different to the mainland, Auckland, and how they thought, but quite similar among themselves. So this was ultimately what we did here, was a social profile and impact assessment. We went out there, and just as you might do an environmental profile, list which species are present and do an environmental impact assessment and determine what the impacts are of an eradication happening. There might be a risk to these rail species, you might have to take your stock off. We can do a social impact assessment and say what's going to change on your island in the short term and the long term even if we do some of these things which involve removing an invasive species permanently and instigating biosecurity and so on. And these social aspects are interrelated, and few, if any, can be considered independently from biodiversity conservation and invasive species eradication. These people have issues with their livelihoods, with their young people leaving the island to seek employment in cities, with too many tourists coming and interfering with the isolation they cherish living on an island. They have strong links to the environment and a perceived clean, green lifestyle, which makes them anti-toxin. All of this is wrapped up, and we just can't take it apart and turn up and say, I know you've got unemployment, I know you've got issues with the next generation of children, we're just here to solve the biodiversity problem, and we don't want to talk about that. Indeed, it comes up so far forward as saying, if you've got $1 million for an eradication for the island, we want to use it for developing a new school and upgrading our church, rather than just saying we want $1 million for eradication. And there's also stronger linkages among aspects of governance and planning, infrastructure, livelihoods, visitors, and community. So they are a tighter network of people. And there's some really interesting work in the European Journal of Personality Research by an Italian psychologist. I think he was considered quite fringe, but he studied some of the islands and found that after generations living on an island, the people, just like a biological founder effect from a small population of rats, say, getting to an island, when people go to islands aren't just a random subset of people that don't go to islands. They've got a particular mentality, and then they live for 6 or 7 generations on that island. It changes their personality at the genetic level even. He found evidence that their dopamine receptors were altered from generations of living on Italian offshore islands. Sorry, Piero. So ecologists recognize the context specificity of pest identity. So we know foxes are different from cats. So you wouldn't just go to an island and say, oh, it's foxes, it's cats, it's rats, it's mice, it's just the same eradication method. We know all these mammals are different. So similarly, we have to appreciate that every island is different from every other island from a social profile makeup. And it's equally important to acknowledge differences among island communities and how they will respond to an invasive species eradication proposal. So that's where I come to strategic environmental assessment. So this is the analytical and participatory approaches that aim to integrate environmental considerations into policies, plans, and programs and evaluate the interlinkages with economic and social considerations. It's fair to say I started as a rat biologist, but I drank the social science Kool-Aid and I liked it. We can't just look at eradication as something downstream at the very end of a series of events. Hey, there's lots going on this island, but let's just deal with this little biodiversity problem and sort that out. We need to build invasive species eradications into the thinking as part of an outcome, an opportunity in how islands live and persist and go about their day-to-day lives, particularly so for examples we'll see shortly in the tropics. So it's an overarching framework of a collection of tools rather than a single fixed and prescriptive approach. So it's things like social impact assessment, social profiling, economic cost-benefit analysis, environmental impact assessment as a part of it. You can draw on parts of these as required for your island. In that regard, doesn't it sound a lot like the operational planning for an invasive species eradication, where we have a set of tools and we use the subset of them, ground-based, hand broadcast, aerial, as required on an island to fit its particular context. We can do exactly the same for the social components of islands. So importantly, invasive species eradication on inhabited islands is not just a technical problem. It's not just a case of get some choppers in the air or get some poison and bait stations on the ground. It's about the larger constructs going on in that community. So those are some of the tools in that toolbox there that I went through: cost-benefit analysis, baselining, social marketing and environmental education, environmental and social monitoring, many of them that should happen well in advance, continue through the eradication, and happen well into the future as well. I've talked recently about invasive species denial, denialism that originates from groups with vested interests in opposition to scientific consensus. It often arises when science enters the policy arena and policy outcomes threaten to impact the freedoms or behaviours of others. Ideas around whether a species should be eradicated or how biosecurity should be implemented. I want to highlight that disagreement and denial are not the same. I think there's only a very small, possibly vocal, but a minority of people that actually deny the impacts of invasive species. But there are a lot of people that have valid stakeholder disagreements over invasive species management. So I think it's important here that debates on invasive species impacts must take into account both the evidence presented and the motivations for people when they're countering arguments for invasive species eradication. So some good work that's come out of University of Exeter lately has this chart, and it shows you the conflict curve, and you might start off over time, and as you build up there might be trigger points, and you can move from expressed disagreement, positions formed, an escalation phase, a very destructive phase where there's two camps locked up for and against eradication, and we want to go out of that and hopefully de-escalate it, not move into a stalemate where you're locked without making eradication progress, and come out and hopefully find a resolution so that we can move forward with biodiversity conservation in a wider context in the island. So historically, the focus of invasive species impacts has been on biodiversity values, but like I said, invasive species impacts extend to agriculture, economies, health, and cultures. They've been under-considered compared to their impacts on species and ecosystems, and I think that reflects our biases as biologists. And management of invasive species is thus critical to protection of island livelihoods and in island development programs. And the way I want to illustrate that is with some recent work with the ISSG and island conservation and Jean-Yves Meyer in French Polynesia, where we looked at mammal eradications on small island developing states, tropical independent island nations throughout the world. And we can see a very substantial bias here. We've done a lot of good mammal eradications around the world. Island Conservation have a poster showing 1,200 examples of them, but 90% of them have been on the islands of wealthy nations, and only 10% have been on independent nations. And those are countries where the impacts of invasive species are even more particular for their livelihoods. And so we need to build in invasive species management as a broader development program on these islands, as something they can use as well as philanthropic investment and economic delivery. So finally, I want to give an example of Fernando de Noronha in Brazil. It has cats, rats, mice, and teiju. I'll be giving a talk for a colleague on Thursday about this wonderful new invasive species, the teiju, we've discovered. It's about a 1,600 hectare island with about 2,000 residents and 500 tourists coming and going a day. It has federal and state land managers. Wildlife is managed in a disease context, cats for their public health impacts and rats for leptospirosis, not for their biodiversity impacts. High levels of poverty and unemployment. And the use of strategic environmental assessment would allow invasive species management within a broader development framework with emphasis on tourism. People come to this island because it has 3 of the 5 most pristine beaches in the world. But there's no seabirds on these beaches because they've been removed from the main island to the subsidiary islands. So if we can convince the government here in this position that they need to factor in invasive species management as a broader suite of what's going on the island, that will be critical. So this leaves me the opportunity to touch on Predator-Free New Zealand 2050 in advance of Mick Clout's talk on Thursday evening. So you've all heard about this idea that New Zealand hopes to remove stoats, rats and possums from the entirety of all the island archipelago of New Zealand by 2050. I'll cut through this very quickly. We've done a lot of eradications. We've only done them on very small islands. We need to do them on much bigger islands. Up the north there is Aotea, Great Barrier Island I've already spoken about. Down the south is Rakiura, and we're undertaking a social impact assessment there for predator eradication. Across the mainland of New Zealand, 45% of it currently receives some form of predator management, particularly around our primary industries and trying to prevent bovine tuberculosis spread. So there's already a lot of predator control going on in New Zealand, but what we need to do is scale it up by using tools such as provided by strategic environmental assessment, social impact assessment in particular, to understand how predator control and eradication will play a role in the lives of all New Zealanders. Because at the moment, only 0.25% of the New Zealand mainland actually receives the level of predator suppression that is achieved on offshore islands to allow us to restore some of our most vulnerable species. So in summary, on inhabited islands, the challenge is not the people per se, but how they are engaged. SCA provides the policy tool by which the role of invasive species eradication as a conservation intervention can cascade throughout all levels of the decision-making process on islands. And it's not just for decisions about wildlife management, but it's around sustainability of the environment and the livelihoods of human communities on islands. Because as Bisbal will tell you, and anyone else that's worked on inhabited islands, at the end of the day, the communities truly value the removal of those invasive species from their islands. So thank you very much, and I'm happy to take a few questions if there's time.
Thank you, James. We do have time for some questions, so thanks for keeping to time. If you put your hand up, we'll send a microphone up to you so we can actually hear this and it can be recorded. We need to use the microphones. Thank you.
Hey, James. Interesting talk. I know that SEA and social impact assessment is used more widely in environmental consulting. Do you have an understanding of why it hasn't been taken up at the same level in the eradication world?
I think that's a good question. I think it's good because SEA and social impact assessment are commonly used in tourism developments on islands and and I've seen examples in oil refinery developments as well. Ultimately, we're just, I think, a bit late to the party of the fact that eradication is just a large technological change being put on a small community. And there's decades of work in this area of what happens when you build a new factory in a remote farming community. And we're just doing exactly that. We're proposing a massive technological change with social and biodiversity impacts called eradication. And we're doing it on small communities. And in this case, they happen to be island communities. So we're lucky that in that regards, we do have a running start for a few decades of information, of scholarship that can feed into this. But I think it's unique to start considering biodiversity in the human-human conflict stage, and something else that the University of Aberdeen has led a lot of impressive work on, realizing that when people have disagreements about whether to remove rats or not, the rats don't actually have a voice. There's just two groups of humans, and so ultimately what we're talking about is a human-human conflict. And as we've grown to appreciate that, I think that's bringing our biodiversity management aspirations into this broader context.
Yeah, other questions? Yes, one up here, and I think another one over here. And then we might leave it at that.
Thanks, James. I think there is maybe a third category of islands. There is the ones that are inhabited, and the one that cannot be considered inhabited because there are a few rangers or a few visitors during the year. But we have, for example, in the Seychelles, many islands that have tourist resorts. And there, the turnover of the staff is also extremely high. There's no families and so on, and they can be like 700 of people, you know, like 150 or so, permanently staying there. They are changing all the time, and it's a real challenge.
So yes, Gerard, I think there's a different set of challenges there, which is around the fact that they don't have that rich tapestry of internal conflict, because being a company on those resorts, they'll probably be run as a top-down sort of infrastructure where there is a chief executive officer or someone that can dictate what happens. And so certainly there's probably institutional management tools, I would imagine, for trying to get your employees to do what they're told, because I appreciate the challenges you have in the Seychelles and on other islands with trying to get those people to engage in conservation and ongoing biosecurity. And so you're right, there's probably another set of tools we can draw on there to get that happening as well.
And several stakeholders sometimes.
Thank you. One final question over here.
Yeah, I guess one of the things I'm thinking about, seeing your talk and then the bait station one and several things that have occurred in the last few years, is I look at these things and I'm thinking about examples in public health, in agriculture, where people are implementing things. And one of the things I'm thinking about is anybody looking at how to apply sort of the general lessons on eradications that have been done for agriculture in situations or in public health? Because a lot of the stuff is similar to that and the experiences people had. I almost think that we're reinventing the wheel.
You're saying you don't... I think one of the key differences that emerges is when the impact of a technological change or on an invasive species is directly on human values. So I was out this morning learning about giant hogweed and how that produces a toxic sap, which is a huge problem. And people do behave very differently when it impacts them personally, either their health or their economic bottom line. And so we've still been coming from the past from this direction of trying to argue for conservation for the biodiversity's sake, its own intrinsic value. And I think the evidence is coming out now that species we previously considered just impacting biodiversity values actually have a broad suite of impacts on agriculture and economic bottom lines and public health. And so we can draw on that, I think, as well.
Okay, I think we'll stop at that. Thank you, James. That was an excellent presentation.
Thank you, Mick.
Addressing a very important issue which is on the horizon. Now, the next speaker is Phil Bell from New Zealand. He works for an agency called Zero Invasive Predators. He is the brother of Biz Bell, who spoke earlier, so you may see the family resemblance slightly. And so Phil is going to be speaking about island eradication within large landscapes, the move and protect model.
Cool. Thank you, Mick. Good afternoon, guys. So I've been with Zero Invasive Predators since we seeded the idea, and I took the opportunity to step out of the New Zealand Department of Conservation to continue progressing it. As Mick said, I am Biz's little brother, and so this sort of stuff is in our blood, thanks to our dad. And I'll just start by setting a bit of context about what led to ZIP's establishment, explain what the remove and protect model is and how we're going about developing it, and then finish up with an example of some new thinking we're bringing to an age-old problem. But firstly, just for clarity's sake, When I say predators, this is what I mean: rats, stoats, and possums. Now, these invasive predators are the cause of the majority of ecological damage in most ecosystems of New Zealand. Now, of course, there are exceptions to that rule, but generally these are public enemy number 1, 2, and 3. And so these are the target species for ZIP. Now, these have been the target species for us Kiwis for a long time now, and we've been pretty good at coming up with novel ways in which to get rid of them. It started sort of 50 odd years ago with the old man and his merry men running around to remove them off islands, and then we've just done that in better and better ways. And then more recently, New Zealanders developed predator fencing, where we could make small areas of the mainland much like an island and then undertake eradications there. Where we do those eradications, native biodiversity tends to recover really well. Unfortunately, on the vast majority of the mainland, we can't use the tools of eradication. So we can't use predator fencing in most places due to terrain or social reasons. Lots of people aren't particularly keen on a 2-metre high metal fence near them. And likewise, we can't use aerial bredificum due to legal restriction. So what that leaves us with in the vast majority of the mainland of New Zealand is the suppression model. So we knock back the predators with either cyclical use of toxins such as 1080, or we have sustained ground control through trapping. Unfortunately, that just knocks the predators back, so they come back again, which means we just put in the same inputs over and over and over, and we get stuck in a cost model that looks something like this. Because of a place like New Zealand, where our predator control budget is very limited and doesn't really grow over time, only a small fraction of New Zealand is afforded predator control. And therefore, our native biodiversity is pretty much doing this in the vast majority of the country. So a couple of years ago, an opportunity arose where the Next Foundation, who are a strategic philanthropic investor in projects seeking transformative change for the environment, joined up with the New Zealand government through the Department of Conservation to establish a program looking at a new way to tackle this predator problem on the mainland. Out of that partnership, ZIP was born. And we were born for this single purpose. Basically, our mission is to take us from this to something that's more akin to island eradications, where a big upfront investment will pay for the cost of infrastructure, will pay for the cost of the removal of the predators, and then all we're left with is the relatively low ongoing maintenance of the biosecurity costs. So, what are we doing for this? How are we going to pull this off? We call that the remove and protect model. So what we do is we take a large landscape. In our case, we're mainly targeting peninsulas at the moment due to their relative ease of defence. We only have to worry about kind of one invasion front through the mainland. We remove the predators from that site, and then we protect that site from reinvasion through what we term the virtual barrier. And I'll explain a bit more about that in a second. And then, as nothing is 100% proof, we have a system where we will detect and respond to any invaders before a population re-establishes. Now, this model's not really that new. Like, this is what we do on islands anyway. All we're trying to do is make islands on the mainland. And we are pretty confident that if we can prove this model and continue to develop it, we will be able to scale this up to landscapes of hundreds of thousands of hectares in size and be able to recover our native biodiversity in the long term. Of course, we've got to prove the model works first. So ZIP was spun out of the government as a specialist R&D entity. We're a purpose-built research and development team. We've got engineers and scientists working side by side, developing their prototypes that our field rangers then implement. We operate under a culture that we call try, sense, and respond. So, as you'll see in this diagram, basically we come up with the prototypes and then we run really small-scale field tests in order to expose all the flaws along the way so that we can really rapidly find out what's wrong with it, or hopefully find out what's really good about it and then amplify that test up so that we can know that it will work as the scale increases. The really awesome thing about the partnership with the Department of Conservation, means that they've been able to hand us a field development site where we can do this testing in the real world and learn what works. So that site is what we call Bottle Rock Peninsula. It's in the Marlborough Sounds. It's 400 hectares in size. And the really useful thing for us is this is not a high-value biodiversity site. So it means that we've been able to manipulate it without any fear of hurting the vulnerable species that would have been there if it was a high-value site. And so we've done things like removed the predators and then we've just put them straight back, but only with radio collars, so they'll run around and tell us where they've been. And it's here at Bottle Rock that we've been developing what we call our virtual barrier. Now, the virtual barrier consists of, to be honest, it's nothing more glamorous than a whole lot of traps. So what it is at the neck of the peninsula where you see on the right-hand side, we have multiple lines set 100 metres apart across the 2K neck of the peninsula. And then along those lines, we have traps every 10 metres. So we've got an incredibly high density of traps through that barrier system. Now, when you have traps, you have a lot of labour generally. One of the things we've managed to develop as part of this virtual barrier is a remote reporting system that tells us what's going on with our traps. That means that we've been able to use things like leg hole trapping for possums, which is by far and away the most effective trap we have, but it's a live capture trap. So under New Zealand legislation, that trap would need to be checked every single day because it may catch a live animal. With our remote reporting system, only the traps that have caught an animal need to be attended to, and we have managed to get New Zealand law to approve our system so that we are completely under legislation and it's happy days. Now, with our virtual barrier, our targets, we aim to screen 95% of all possums that try to invade and 99% of all rats that are having a go at it. We're not working on defending against stoats at this scale because Bottle Rock is only 400 hectares and that's basically small beans for a stoat that can run many hundreds of Ks and therefore would be able to get in and out of Bottle Rock before we even knew it was there in the first place. So right now, we're able to intercept 92% of possums and 95% of rats. So we know there is still work to be done, but we are highly encouraged by these results and we are pushing on. Now, what are we going to do about the ones that get in there? So this is where we're deciding that we're going to just change it up a little bit in terms of what we've traditionally done with biosecurity. And I'm going to use rats as the example of that. So this is pretty much how I see island biosecurity detection for rats at the moment. We try to get inside the rat's head to know what it'll be thinking when it gets to our predator-free island, and then we design a detection network to intercept it. The problem with that is that the work we've done, and the work that's been done a lot more thoroughly by others over the past decade or so, including lots of people in this room, shows us that all rats are individuals, and as such, they all act very differently. Which means if you're trying to design a network that will detect all the rats that come at you, it has to be a really intensive network. And a really intensive network means that you have a whole lot of devices you've got to pay for and a whole lot of devices you've got to service. And so what we're talking about here is a system where we need to get away from that intensity. Our model won't stack up if we have to have heaps of devices everywhere. So what we need to do is get out of this model and into something that's new. So what we're wondering about is, what if we don't care about that individual incursion? I mean, it may sound controversial, but when you start thinking about landscapes that are thousands and thousands of hectares in size, the impact a single rat is going to have in the lonely time that it's running around with no buddies is actually bugger all. And so, therefore, the odd one that gets in is probably not a big deal. So what we thought is, why don't we just worry about the time that we have an invasion? What about if we design only for the pregnant female when she arrives and has her litter? That way, we will have up to 10 individuals to be able to detect and hit our detection devices rather than just one, so that helps with our probability of detection. The dispersal pattern of that first litter is probably going to be big enough to allow for a minimal infrastructure network. And so by that, I'm thinking one device every 30 or 40 hectares. But we would still be able to place that inside the footprint to enable enough of an encounter rate to ensure that they have a crack at it. And then the really interesting thing is, we think that because of the development time for a juvenile, we've probably got about 100 days in which to pick up this invasion before generation 2 emerges and the problem's escalated. And then when you couple that with the in-field data transmission developments that we've got underway and the fact that we've proven that sort of technology already over 580,000 trap nights in our barrier system, and the artificial intelligence that recognises the signature features of a rat, we think that network could be fully automated. Now, I completely acknowledge that that is a risky strategy. Obviously, the response is going to have to be a lot bigger because we have to make sure that we've cleaned up the entire litter. And also, the invasion rate into the area needs to be very, very low for those response costs to be manageable over time. But we actually think that response could be aerially deployed as well. So again, it won't necessarily need to be people out there running around to track down these rats. But of course, that leads to a key question of knowing whether or not that dispersal pattern will be big enough in order to lay out a minimal detection network. And so we decided we would mimic an invasion. So we bred up some ship rats. We birthed them in a cage, and we took that cage up to a rat-free place in Taranaki, and we let them go. They all had a biomarker in them that the mother had fed to them through her milk, and we have been killing them off one at a time to see where they are. In 50 days of running around, the furthest that any of those rats have dispersed is 700 metres in a straight line. So we're pretty confident that this network is well set up. This dispersal pattern could well set us up for a minimal infrastructure network. Now, as you've heard, predator-free New Zealand is the goal. New Zealand has lots and lots of sticky out places that we think are well suited to a remove and protect model. So we are confident that some of the tech that we're developing will help pave the way to that future. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Phil. I think we'll have to leave it at that. We'll just move on to the next speaker, so thank you. The next speaker is a friend of mine, an old colleague of mine, Federico Méndez-Sánchez, and there's about 16 other authors on this paper, all from Mexico. And Fede, as we know him, who is the Executive Director of Conservación de Islas, which is an organization that's doing wonderful work eradicating from islands around Mexico and elsewhere, in fact. So he's going to be talking today about Mexico's progress and commitment to comprehensive island restoration. Fede.
Thank you, Mick. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm really thrilled to be here. And I want to start saying that Mexico's commitment and progress throughout the years, our goal, or the goal that drives us on what we do, is that we are aiming at getting all Mexico's islands free from invasive mammals by 2030. So that's something that we are planning, and we believe it's doable. So just an update from the past conference in Auckland 7 years ago. We were mostly focusing on mammal eradication. So at that time, we already completed 49 successful eradications on 39 islands, and we were documenting the outcomes, positive outcomes from those interventions, mostly on seabirds and native vegetation, particularly on Guadalupe Island. But also we were starting a pilot project on seabird social attraction on a couple of islands. It was the first project of its type in Latin America, and as I already said, we were documenting recovery of vegetation on some of islands where we mostly remove ungulates. Now, this is the update to date. It's been 23 years of intensive work, and we are now on 60 eradications on 39 islands. Of those 39 islands, 30 of them are completely mammal-free. The other ones are still with probably 1 or 2 populations of invasive mammals, and we're working on around 7 of those. So the map shows you the green dots are the completed eradications. The yellow ones are the ones where we're working at the moment, and the red dots are where we still have pending issues to work. And many, as James was saying, it's a lot of inhabited islands with huge populations of humans. Now, about the restoration or the surface in terms of restoration, it's about 60,000 hectares. And luckily, as the challenges grew up, also the funding. The funding, the long-term funding is difficult to achieve, but luckily our government, but also the funding agencies have seen the remarkable achievements and which has been encouraging. So we have had funding over the years. So this is how the investment has grown recently. And then some examples of our recent interventions. This is the eradication of black rats from an archipelago in the Mexican Caribbean. It's a completely wet tropical island. And so we removed rats from 3 of those islands. And the last one was Cayo Centro. So we did it like a two-phase step. First, the small keys, and then the big one, which is this in the picture, Cayo Centro. So that was done in March 2015. And we were able to quickly or rapidly confirm absence or confirm the eradication a few months later, thanks to a confirmation model made by Samaniego and others. Then another example, and this is a very recent completion of a feral cat eradication on Espiritu Santo Island. This is within the Gulf of California of the Baja California Peninsula of La Paz. We removed cats recently from there, and we're now in the confirmation absence stage. We are also working with goat eradication on that island through live removal and also aerial and ground hunting. And this is a tricky one because it's so near to La Paz that social pressure, social constraints are in place. So that's something we're looking forward and attending. Now, challenging projects. We're very happy to finally, after years of doing intensive control on Guadalupe Island for feral cats, we finally got the funding from NIFWIF and the Carlos Slim Foundation. NIFWIF is the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, to start the eradication 4-year campaign for feral cats on Guadalupe Island. And that's mostly to protect seabirds like the endemic Guadalupe morlet, but also population of lice and albatross that we have there. And a few years ago, while we were getting the funding, we built feral cat proof fence on the south point of the island, so created a 65-hectare peninsula there. And just a couple of years after we built the fence, we got this fellow nesting after 100 years without doing so on the island. So that's remarkable, and that's some of the encouraging results that we want to see after we remove the cats from Guadalupe Island. Talking about inhabited islands, this is Cedros Island, where we're starting dog eradication. So it's a charismatic species on an inhabited island. It's about 4,000 people, mostly fishermen living there. And then our program or our approach goes beyond eradication. So we're also involved with public policies deeply. So we work with Mexico's government to publish back in 2010 a national strategy for invasive species management. And a couple of years later, with a highly participatory involvement with all sectors, all levels of government, we published the national strategy for the islands back in 2012. So this is to set our priorities for the coming years and to establish not only for eradications, but also for human inhabitation and a policy for immigration to the islands and renewable energies, climate change, so all aspects of island environments. We also have moved forward the agenda for protection of the islands. So very recently, just last year during the Conference of the Parties in Cancun in Mexico, Mexico announced, the president announced the last reserve we were needing for protecting all Mexico's islands. So with that biosphere reserve that was created, which is the one you can see in the map, all Mexico's islands are now within protected areas. So that really helps us to move forward the agenda with invasive species management and comprehensive island restoration. We also moved the agenda forward. This is an example of how we got involved in producing the nomination of Revillagigedo Archipelago. It's one of the most remote archipelagos Mexico has. It's about 1,000, between 700 and 1,000 kilometers west in the Mexican Pacific. And we got the nomination luckily last year in July, so it's now a World Heritage Site for Mexico. And then we jump into what happens after removing invasive species. So we have deeply focused on seabed restoration. So we do social attraction monitoring and applied research. There's a talk about this program later on in the week for my colleague Juliana Bedoya, so I encourage you to go there because we have had amazing results in just a few years. Then we're also focusing on applied research. So this goes beyond what, we start working with research for planning the eradications, but we also do work after that. So this is just an example of how we're now monitoring with GPS, that it's the first time that it's being done in Mexico for seabirds, and also matching that with, for example, proposals for IVAs in Mexico. So that's just an example. We're also moving into what happens after you remove ungulates and the vegetation comes back, but then it needs a little bit of a hand. So we're focusing on Guadalupe Island at the moment. So that's a nursery that was built a few years ago. And we're now helping the resilience of the ecosystems to connect some of endemic patches of a forest there. And it involves collecting the seed, using the soil from the island, doing some soil erosion and management, also reforestation and fire prevention. We're also focusing deeply on island biosecurity. So as you can see, or you remember from the map there, the green dots are a lot now. So we want to preserve those as green dots and not go back to be red. So we are partnering with the government and with funds from the Global Environment Facility and the German Cooperation Development area on a national program on island biosecurity. I also encourage you to go to Mariam Zlatovsky's talk about this program. Then deeply with island communities. So we work a lot with environmental culture, learning, and outreach. We take deeply approach on these aspects. So as you can see, we go to the islands, we build rapport with the communities, we talk to them, we stay there for years and building trust, and we do the eradications, but also we stay afterwards and work with them. So this is just some examples. The cat and the rodent there, you see, it's a play that we developed for raising awareness about the invasive mammal issues. And we also develop a lot of materials for the kids mostly, but we also focus on the youth. So the mural you can see down, it's a mural painted by the youth of the islands, the youngsters that were being tell how from local artists. And then as a wrap up, what we're aiming is to have all Mexico's islands free from invasive mammals by 2030. This involves 70 eradications on about 34 islands. It's quite a challenge as we move forward, the islands become bigger and also inhabited, but we believe we can do so in the coming years. So as a conclusions, we are moving forward at a steady pace. All islands, we expect to have all islands by 2030 free from invasive mammals. We are consolidating, and that's kind of a take-home message for us in Mexico, is consolidation of the capacities, which are local capacities. Around 100 staff are young and experienced, so we want to maintain those. There's a strong partnerships with the academia, with postgraduate programs, so many of my colleagues, including myself, have prepared and professionalized in these areas and building bridges with different academic institutions, both nationally and internationally. We want to institutionalize island biosecurity because at the moment it's us as an NGO moving forward the agenda for island biosecurity, but we want the government to take over and the local communities, say the Protected Areas Commission and the Navy, with the local communities that live on the island. So it's to keep up the comprehensive focus, not just eradications, but do a comprehensive island restoration. Seabirds and vegetation, it's our focus at the moment. And keep up with securing long-term funding because challenges are huge coming ahead, and also to strengthen international collaboration. So that's why you see so many of us here. We really like to learn from experience and hear your thoughts and exchange experiences as well. And we have even the idea of why not having an International Islands Institute where all the experience can be matched and we can work together over the world to protect all islands and remove invasive species. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Fede. I think we have time for one or two questions, so don't run away yet.
Good.
Anybody got any questions for Federico? Yes.
Thanks, Federico, for a very inspiring talk. It's amazing to see. We need to clone Hesse throughout the world, for the achievements you've been able to get over the years. One question for you is really you touched on something which is very close to my heart. It's biosecurity becoming integrated within national planning, both particularly by budgetary and also strategic planning. How, from your experience with Mexico, do you have any advice you can give us in terms how we would go about doing that? Because at the moment, it seems that all the projects for eradications are funded from the outside, so they are externally funded, and there is an expectation that biosecurity will happen. So there is no way we can find Father Christmas which will fund biosecurity ad infinitum within a country. So how do we institutionalize it? Do you have any advice?
Yeah. Well, we have tried to flip the coin. So it's about selling, let's say, government-wise, selling the idea of what we have achieved so far. So it's a lot of investment coming from the private sector, let's say nationally and internationally. But we have tried to convince the government that it's worth it to protect that investment. So they are slowly starting, but they are now more and more convinced that it's a necessary thing to implement biosecurity on a cross-national area. And we're also trying to make bridges about biosecurity on different areas, like agricultural aspects. So Mexico has a quite impressive biosecurity program for sectorial agricultural sectors, but not so for islands. So we're trying to build those bridges, and it's about selling them what's at stake, and that we have to to actually take care of those islands that are already free of invasive mammals, and then also implement biosecurity upfront on the new projects. So it's not easy, but it takes time. Yeah.
Okay, I think we'll stop at that. Thank you very much, Fede.
Thank you, Mick.
The next talk was going to be given by David Parrott. Instead, it's going to be given by Ian Henderson, who also works for the Animal and Plant Health Agency in the UK. And he's going to be talking about this topic of using lethal and non-lethal management methods for non-native ungulates on islands, feral pigs, goats and cows, and I think talking about the Virgin Islands amongst other places.
Amongst other places, yeah.
All right.
That's one of the places we've
Over
worked.
to you, Ian.
Okay, thank you very much. I'll move straight off that first slide. I'll tell you a bit about the background of where I work and where Dr. Parrott works as well. We're now called the National Wildlife Management Centre. We're part of the Animal and Plant Health Agency, which in turn is part of the UK Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, or DEFRA. We have a very long history of dealing with human-wildlife conflicts, including invasive species. This goes back 40 or 50 years to the UK coipue eradication and beyond. We've got slides here, ruddy duck, which is my main project. We have wild boar, which are reintroduced native species, which have caused concern in some parts of the UK. We also do a lot of work on badgers and tuberculosis in cattle. So we have a long history. We do work mainly for the government, but we also do some commercial work. And we have a core of about 60 scientists at two main sites, one in Yorkshire, one down in the southwest of England, where the badger and TB problem is at its worst. And we cover quite a wide range of specialities as well, from field ecologists, firearms specialists, veterinarians as well, mathematical biologists, GIS specialists. We have a very, very wide range of staff in terms of expertise. we look at this problem, if you like, in two different ways of addressing it. There's a large number of non-lethal methods available, but a lot of these are managing the problem. They're not really reducing the problem. It's something that will go on and on and on, and that means that there are costs, which are incurred forever and a day, basically. So really what we're looking at trying to do is reduce the problem or remove it entirely if we can, whether that's native or non-native animals. Now what I'd like to do from this point on is look at it's a small number of specific case studies, but looking at two methods. One is shooting, which is the traditional method, if you like, and one is fertility control, which is a relatively new method, but may well have some important applications in the future, but we seem to be in relatively early days for that. Now at this point I should stress that I have had little to do with the case studies that we're looking at, so if at any point I give the impression I don't really know what I'm talking about, there's good reason for that. So starting off with fertility control, I'm looking at the ideal contraceptive. You're looking at two things really, the ideal for the individual and the ideal for the population. So in terms of the individual, you're looking at animal welfare, you're looking at its long-term effectiveness, you're looking at how easily and how effectively you can deliver that contraceptive. In terms of the population, it has to be inexpensive to produce and administer. It has to be species specific, and that is incredibly important for obvious reasons. It shouldn't affect the spatial and social behaviour of the species that you're dealing with, and you must be able to deliver it to a large proportion of the population, or it's pretty much pointless doing it. So we have novel immunocontraceptives that we're working on, which are vaccines that induce antibodies against proteins or hormones that are essential for reproduction. There's two main ones that we've been looking at. One is the GnRH, which is the one that we have been using. It's commercially produced as Gonacon, I believe. And there's also the porcine zona pellucida, which we haven't been involved with. These are single-dose vaccines, but they have to be injected, which obviously brings its own problems. All the studies that have been done on these different, or these two vaccines suggest that you can get a fairly high percentage of infertility, so 75 to 100%, for between 2 and 8 years. That's relatively good. But as I'll come on to, I think it's on relatively small numbers of animals that have been injected. So in practice, I think there's more development work to be done. The first case study is wild boar, which I think are an increasing problem across Europe, certainly. They were native to the UK for thousands of years, but they were killed out basically in the 17th century, I think was the last one. We've had a new introduction from escapes. They were brought over for farming, and a number have escaped over the last 20 or 30 years. So we now have a number of populations around the UK, the main ones down in the southwest of England, and there have been concerns about that on a number of fronts. They cause significant amounts of damage. They are a reservoir for diseases that can transmit to free-range pigs, for example. Major cause of traffic accidents, some of which are fatal, I believe, in some parts of the country. And as you can see from photographs, significant damage to agriculture and infrastructure as well. There are some horror stories around of attacks on dogs and attacks on people, some of which you have to perhaps take with a pinch of salt. It's hard to know the truth of some of these, whether it's just over-exaggerated by the press, perhaps. So looking at the single-shot contraceptive, we have a facility at York where we can take in captive animals and they're kept in pens, and we do research under fairly strict control on them in terms of welfare and so on. So we've had wild boar for over 10 years now at the Sand Hutton site in York. And as you can see from the first, the top bars there, in 2004 we injected 6 animals, so only 6. But over the next 8, 9, 10 years, they produced no litters whatsoever. We also had a control group, obviously, which received the same vaccination, and all of those produced litters in the first year. So there's a huge difference there. The worry is that it's only 6 animals in each group. We carried out basically the same test again starting in 2005 with separate animals. That was slightly less successful, so 1 litter was produced in the group that had been vaccinated. The 6 animals who weren't vaccinated obviously all produced litters. We confirmed by, I think it was fecal examination for progesterone, that the estrous cycle had been stopped completely in the animals that received the contraceptive. The second one is feral goats, which is actually out in the field this was done. It's a very small area in North Wales, it's a peninsula, where there's been about 200 feral goats for the last 140 years or so. They have been increasing in number and they have been causing problems. So they come into the gardens in the town, they damage the delicate plant communities out on the headland. It's just jutting out into the Irish Sea, and there have been signs of poor health. But having said that, they're a well-known tourist attraction. The council policy is not to cull, and the council own a significant part of the land that the goats are on. I think the other area is owned by the National Trust, which also have concerns about culling. And there's limited opportunities to just translocate the goats because probably no one else wants them anyway. So we had a roundup of these goats, and I think it was about something like 200 in total. We got the help of the army to round these things up. It's fairly labour intensive to get everyone in. The reason the army was involved is the goats, the army pick a goat every so often to be a mascot for the Royal Welsh Regiment. And it has the rank of Lance Corporal, I'm told. So they helped us pen them in. All the animals have to be penned in. When they were penned, we would take out certain numbers for vaccination, and others were released without being vaccinated, but we had a good grip on the numbers involved. So that was the result of the single dose contraception rather. 83 to 92% reduction in productivity over 3 years. Again, pretty impressive, I think, but it wouldn't have been cheap to collect them all up, and it will need to be repeated. Obviously, you're not getting hold of every breeding female. One of the other things we do is we do a lot of modelling back in the office in Sandhutton, looking at the impact of management and the impact in the longer term of doing these things. So you can see from the chart there, if you have 65% vaccinated every 3 years, you have a big reduction. I think the big reduction is actually a translocation or a removal. It could be translocation or culling out, but it's a big reduction to begin with by removing a significant part of the population. And from that point, you can see how the population recovers if you vaccinate a certain proportion every fixed term, whether it's 3 years or every 4 years. We've done work overseas. Hong Kong has been one of them. One of the interesting things about working a number of overseas areas is the cultural issues that you have to address, as was mentioned earlier in New Zealand. It's not just about turning up and doing the work. You have to take into account cultural attitudes to animals and opposition to what you might be doing. In terms of Hong Kong, this was done at the request of the Chinese government, or the Hong Kong government. We were dealing with very, very small numbers again. In the first year, we were looking at cattle only. So it was less successful here, where we treated some animals, about a third ended up pregnant, but it was 100% in the control group. In the second year, we also did it on water buffalo because they're such similar species. So there's some evidence it works, but it does need to go further. So we need to, from this point, proceed to field trials perhaps, and maybe test on other species. But as I said, it's right at the very early days of this. It's got potential, but there's an awful long way to go. This is moving on to the more traditional approach, if you like, which is culling by shooting of larger vertebrates, much larger than most other people have mentioned. So you're looking at feral goats, feral cattle, possibly feral donkeys. They cause major impact in many areas, many small islands, particularly in the Caribbean. They can cause direct impact by degradation. They can also compound the impact of other introduced predators. They encourage the growth of other plants which are much less friendly to native vegetation, to native animals rather. And again, they're a potential disease reservoir. One of the cultural problems we have here is that they also form a food source for some of the local peoples. Feral goats, feral cattle are food source, and a lot of local people don't want them removed entirely. But at the end of the day, that's probably the most effective way to deal with it. On Montserrat in particular, we had the problem of the volcano, which exists in the middle of the island, and there's a no-go area basically around the volcano. So no one's allowed in there. That means the goats and the cattle have free rein, okay? So there's a number of issues about mapping before you start any work, knowing exactly what you're dealing with. A lot of the work we have done is training local people to address their local concerns and make sure that what we are telling them to do is in line with what will work in practice in the local area. That's just a quick one of pre and post culling. You can see quite a big reduction there. Notably, a lot of cattle out at night, and there seems to be a slight move of cattle from daytime activity to nighttime activity, possibly to avoid the shooting. So very briefly, a summary. The final slide I've got up is some colleagues who know a lot more about the issue than I do. Messrs. Ridley and Sandon are here today. They're up there in the middle somewhere, so you can track them down later. That's their email addresses as well. They're firearms specialists who did the work in the Caribbean. Giovanna is my team leader who's done a lot of work on the fertility control. So if anyone's got any queries, an email to Giovanna would be grand.
Thanks, Ian. I think Ian has indicated we should ask the questions to other people anyway, so
That's fine.
We'll leave it at that. So thank you very
Okay,
much.
all right.
And we'll move on to the last speaker, who is Gilbert Castellanos, who's going to be speaking. Someone else? Okay, it's Greg Howard, who's going to be speaking about the Arctic Plan. Is that correct?
Yep.
All right.
Thank you.
I'll leave it to you. I think there he is, Greg Howard, not Gilbert Castellanos, and it's a plan to deal with invasive species on islands in the Arctic.
Thanks, Mick. There was a last-minute change. Gilbert Castellanos couldn't be here today. Initially, it was supposed to be Jamie Reeser with the United States National Invasive Species Council as the lead author of this presentation. Gilbert was second in line, but due to the U.S. government restrictions, they are not able to attend. So just like in the White House, where grief is rolling downhill, here it's spilling down to me, where I'm third in line and will be giving the presentation for you. I'm going to be covering a little bit of some of the work that's just starting. For us, it's just starting. I represent an NGO, Island Conservation. It's an NGO that's headquartered in California. I'm the North American Regional Director. I engage a lot with governments, particularly a United States government, and I'm just starting a dialogue with them looking at the issue of alien species on the islands in the Arctic. It's a topic that's opening up for us and for the government. And again, Jamie Reeser sends her regards as the U.S. National Invasive Species Council Secretariat. So the Arctic, it's a place of change. We're reading about it almost on a daily basis for the last number of years. Most recently, there's the Arctic Council that was established that initiated an Arctic biodiversity assessment. The Arctic Biodiversity Assessment was released in May 2013, and it was basically the scientific basis for the change that we're seeing. What's happening in the Arctic? What are the issues? What are the opportunities? It's recognizing, most importantly for us in the context of islands, is that unlike the White House and Donald Trump, that it actually recognizes climate change. It acknowledges it, it's very important, and with that climate change, the Arctic, as we all seen in the news over the last number of years, is changing, and it's changing rapidly. The Northwest Passage is opening up. Invasive wasp for the first time, I believe last boreal summer, was detected for the first time on Baffin Island in Canada. Natural movement of introduced species. And increasing human activity increases the risk that species will be introduced onto some of these islands. So with that, the biodiversity assessment came up with some recommendations, of which recommendation 9 is looking at and recognizes the threat of invasive species and looking at sort of a classic response. In early detection, rapid response, looking at ways to intercept or close pathways of introduction early before they get there. We know that a lot of the invasive species have not made it yet into the Arctic, but we know that they're coming. Looking at these pathways, trying to close them, and also building capacity within the region, because it's the people that are living there that are ultimately going to inherit the outcomes of these introductions that may come. The Arctic Council, it's a series of board members from 8 Arctic countries, in addition to the indigenous populations that are represented as a full voting member. There are some observers from outside the non-Arctic countries, international organizations such as nonprofits. And what they've done is they've asked conservation on Arctic flora and fauna and the protection of the marine environment to work together, 2 sub-councils within the Arctic Council to work together, focusing on invasive species and develop looking at the strategy for the prevention and management of invasive species across the Arctic, regardless of country, again within the Arctic Council, among the 8 countries that are represented. There's a steering committee that's been formed. The US, Jamie Reeser, standing right in the middle there in the gray and black scarf around her neck, have been working together with Norway as a co-chair, and the other members of the steering committee looking at development of a plan, looking at the strategy on invasive alien species strategy and action plan. And for the last 18 months, they've been working on it and have come up with a strategy and action plan, which you can actually download online if you're interested. It's been adopted officially at the Arctic Council meeting that was held this past May in Fairbanks in Alaska, and it falls into 3 broad categories: inspire urgent and effective action, advance capacities for well-informed decision-making, and undertake prevention, early detection, and rapid response activities, which includes the immediate eradication as possible. I have no idea what this slide is about. I literally received this presentation late last week and the talking points late last evening. So we'll just take a second and read. Long enough. And we know that the focus on invasive alien species from islands, we know the importance of islands, the risk that invasive species present. We know at this point anyways that the biological invasion on Arctic islands is relatively low. We know that once invasive species are removed, ecosystems can and do recover. And there have been a number of successful vertebrate eradications from Arctic islands that sort of form the basis. And looking at the return on investment, really the trigger for governments for doing this work and looking at this work is the return on investment. So what's the proposed plan moving forward? Again, this is early days, but what we're looking at is looking at relevant data, make it available through open access information systems, summarize the available data to generate information on current knowledge, essentially a gap analysis, looking at executing a strategy to fill those data gaps, and looking at a prioritization scheme for determining which island eradications will take precedent and why. Sarah, put up your hand. Is she in the room? Sarah Veach, there she is right there. If you want to talk a little bit more about that prioritization scheme, she's taking some of the lead with this under the US NIST Secretariat. Ongoing, looking at the Arctic Council members, we're looking at priorities. Basically, it is about the Arctic, about the communities, the countries, the indigenous people that are really going to inherit. And so we're looking at assessment of the data. Once we know that, we're going to work with them to determine what are the priorities, particularly with an emphasis on vertebrates at this point in time. And then move forward with plans looking at eradications, where the opportunities are, and begin to move forward looking at co-financing strategies, additional resources, and then implementation. So where are we at this point? Is Steve in the room? Steve Everett, did he make it? Yet another US government casualty, huh? This is Steve Ebert. He's been instrumental. He's probably got the most experience within the U.S. government right now, doing a lot of this work within the Arctic, subarctic, out of Alaska. He's with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Refuge System. In conjunction with him and others, we're looking at, actually part of this exercise here with this talk is actually to identify ourselves to you and anybody who has an interest in the Arctic, looking at what we just laid out and want to have a discussion afterwards. Talk to me or Sarah afterwards. We'd be very interested. There will be an international data call because we really don't have any data. There's really no information out there. So this is going to be starting here in the next few months. My colleague Nick Holmes is going to be a part of, as he shakes his head, he's going to be a part of the data assessment and pulling it together. And more importantly, in some sense, is actually communicating this not only to our government leaders, our communities, and cultures within the Arctic, but outside the Arctic to validate this program. Jamie's actually very interested in any success stories from the Arctic, and if anybody has any success stories that they're willing to share, actually for that matter from the Antarctic, relevant Antarctic stories certainly would be relevant. She's working with a National Geographic writer to expand and really promote at a very high level within government systems and outside. And we're looking at the possibility of doing a workshop once we have this data in, hopefully early 2018 is the target at this point. So with that, I thank you very much, and I believe I'm the last person for the day.
Greg, that was very quick. We have time for a few questions. Okay, and then I'm going to have some words from Tony. So I think we have time for at least a couple of questions. So if there are any about this Arctic plan, hands up. Carol West.
I'm curious, is Greenland part of the initiative?
Yeah, it's covered, if I can go back to the first, there's eight countries covered, and I believe it is. Where is, I can't read that. Right at the bottom? There we go, thank you. Let's see where the list is. Yeah.
They're not on the slide. They were part of the meetings, but they're not on the slide.
They're not on the slide. There you go. Thank you. Quick enough.
So, okay. Other questions then?
Hello. I was just going to ask if the Russian Federation were approached to join in with this.
They were. They've been encouraged, and they are in dialogue, but they are a loose participant, is my understanding from that at this point.
Okay. If there are no other questions, I think we'll stop there. Thank you very much, Rick.
Thank you.
Hold on. We'll just have Tony would like to say a few words, I think, about what's happening next.
Yes, thanks. Is Alison here? Okay, I think I can manage. We have something called an app, whatever that is. Alison was supposed to announce this morning, but it slipped her memory. One accesses this app, apparently, by going to your app store and typing in Islands Invasive 2017 or something like that. And it's not the greatest app in the world, I have to say, but it will give you the basics of the program. It doesn't give you the time of the talks for some reason I don't understand. But the good thing is that I'm able to update it. So if we get a sudden change of speaker, as has just happened for a session tomorrow, then I can update it. And apparently on your app, you will see this instantaneously. So I would encourage you to get hold of that. The program is still 96% correct, the printed one. But if you're interested in updates, then go to your app. The second thing is, we all arrived very promptly after lunch today, and I was dead impressed and encouraged I was rather less impressed and encouraged when this afternoon after coffee, a significant proportion of people turned up after the talk started. Can we please make an effort to get here 5 minutes before the session starts? And if you have to be late, please do not pass in front of the speaker. It is very disrespectful to the speaker. So please, if you have to come in late, go up the nearest aisle. Do not go in the front here. And the last thing is just to say that at, I think it's 6:15 this evening, there's a public lecture here. It's in two parts. Lord Gardner is giving a 15-minute presentation on invasive species in the UK overseas territories. And then I will be giving a rather longer talk, but I trust not too long, about the recent South Georgia habitat restoration project. And you're all very welcome to come along to that. I hope to see you there. Thank you very much.